Alberta Premier Danielle Smith calls it her Stay Out of My Backyard bill. On Wednesday, introducing Alberta Bill 18, the Provincial Priorities Act, it pushes back against what Danielle Smith calls the ongoing overreach from Ottawa in provincial affairs by negotiating with municipalities and provincial bodies directly. If passed, the bill would, quote, require provincial entities to obtain prior approval from Alberta's government before entering into, amending, extending, or renewing an agreement with the federal government. In addition to cities and towns, the bill would also apply to public universities and colleges, school boards, and health entities. Well, take a listen to how the Prime Minister is reacting to the bill already.
We recognize that Canadians need help and support and investment and don't so much care about, whose responsibility it is first and foremost. They just want it to get done. And that's why we are there to work hand in hand in full respect with those provinces who want to solve the problem and ask those provinces that don't want to solve the problem to just get out of the way while we solve that problem that Canadians are facing.
Well, happy to say that we are joined in studio today by the Alberta Premier. Danielle Smith, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
I'll begin with what we heard from the Prime Minister, saying that Canadians don't really care about who pays for something so long as it's solving problems. What's your reaction to what you heard from Justin Trudeau?
Look, I think that people expect fairness out of their federal government. And so when you have a couple of provinces where the federal government deals directly with the premiers and they're able to jointly make an announcement that benefits all municipalities, I think most people think that's pretty fair. That's not what they're doing in Alberta. They're pitting one community against another. They're pitting urban against rural. They're making the municipalities try to jump through hoops to be able to access this funding, and they're not working with us in partnership. So what we decided to do is pass a Provincial Priorities Act, which is very similar to what the Quebec government has passed. And I would note in his announcement, he recognizes that he has to deal with Quebec differently because of that legislation. And what we're asserting is he needs to deal with us in a respectful way because we're getting shortchanged, our municipalities are getting left out, and it's simply not fair.
Okay, except when you mention municipalities, Jody Gondek, the mayor of Calgary, she's already said basically that her city needs investment. And this is money that's on the table right now. So if there's a project that has to be done and someone's willing to pay for it, why not just allow the city, and it might be an exception, but a city like Calgary, which needs investment, to actually get it from the federal government?
Well, I would say that Quebec had the most effective way because they were the very first to get an agreement all the way back in November. And in point of fact, if the federal government had taken the same approach with all of the provinces, we'd probably all have had agreements by now, but they haven't. And so what we have in Alberta is where one municipality has one deal, another has another. So there's 6 small municipalities who also have a third deal, but they've left 350 municipalities out. And in my province, where we are growing faster than we have since 1972, where we are finding that 20 to 25% of all newcomers to the country are coming to Alberta, even though we're only 12% of the population, we have greater demands and greater needs than almost any other province. And we think the federal government should work in partnership with us rather than make political announcements.
Now, to my understanding, the bill introduced, Bill 18, there will be consultations on it with municipalities in the summer. Does that mean then that municipalities and other provincial entities have to stop any type of negotiation that is currently happening with federal officials?
Well, we have said that it will be our expectation on a go forward and it's not going to be retroactive. But I would hope most municipalities would receive it in the spirit that we intended, that we are already shortchanged by our calculation compared to what we're seeing in other provinces, $1 to $2 billion in housing funding. And so we are using this as a mechanism so that every municipality is able to get fair treatment. That's the intention. Okay,
that's the intention. Although, I'm going to read you a quote here, and this was not an interview with us, but this is Jared Wesley, who's a political scientist at U of A. He did an interview with the CBC, and this is what he said. This suggests they're not interested in getting more dollars necessarily, but that this may actually be punitive for institutions that disagree ideologically with the government. What do you say to that?
Look, we have done a cursory review of various agreements that we have. We've got 14,000 agreements. The ones that are potentially problematic are only about 800, because where we find that we have a difference of opinion on with the federal government is their speed with which they want to achieve a net zero target. We believe that we can be aligned if we go on a 2050 net zero target. We have a difference of opinion as well on the issue of safe supply. We don't support it because we support an approach that puts recovery first. So those are the kind of things that we are potentially looking at as being problematic, but I don't think the federal government should be using its federal spending power to come into provincial agencies that we fund and we establish through legislation to try to circumvent our policy priorities. That's all that this is about. And on areas where we can work collaboratively, and I think that we have demonstrated that we can. We've worked together on a healthcare deal, which we did collaboratively. That's the thing I find the most frustrating, is they know how to do this work. They've done it with us before. We signed a 10-year deal, including 4 side deals, because they came to us. They didn't try to go around to each individual hospital to try to get a separate deal with each hospital. It's not appropriate. They know how to do this right. They should do it right in the spirit of cooperative federalism.
Do you see this as a purposeful tactic on behalf of the federal government, rather than, Calgary is expressing a need, Edmonton is expressing a need, let's try to figure this out with municipalities? Or do you think it's far more to undermine your government?
Well, all I can say is that they have demonstrated that when they want to work with us, that they do work with us. There are some ministers who I think we have a very good relationship with. This has been an anomaly, and maybe it's because they're facing pressure from the opposition party, so they feel they have to be in a mad rush, and so they're short-circuiting an appropriate process. But it's not acceptable, because what we need to do is we need to address what the need is and make sure that we're funding the municipalities who need the support in a way that brings both federal and provincial dollars to the table at the same time, as opposed to trying to score political points. That's how I'm perceiving this.
Okay, if it is a time frame crunch for the federal government, as one potential that you suggest, are you willing to work with the federal government on an expedited time frame in order to meet their own goals?
Well, look, I've told my Seniors, Community and Social Services Minister, who is responsible for housing, to do whatever we can to accelerate housing. As I said, we have had 200,000 people increase our population over the last year. We're getting 20 to 25% of the Ukrainian evacuees have been coming to our province. This is a dire need for us as well in Alberta, and so we are doing everything we can to reduce red tape, to identify specific projects that will accelerate housing. And it would just be really nice, knowing that we're doing all this work, to have the federal government working in sync with us as a partner, as opposed to working at cross purposes.
I can't help but note the fact that you are in Ottawa for 24 hours. At the same time, the Prime Minister and the Housing Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister, all of whom were in Vaughan, Ontario, so a good 4.5-hour drive from the nation's capital. Did you try to coordinate some type of meeting to actually have a discussion with them face-to-face about your concerns?
I do always, when I come to Ottawa, reach out to ministers to see if we can meet. This time around, I did want to meet with Mark Miller, because as I mentioned, we've got a very serious issue with making sure that we have enough spaces in our provincial nominee program for newcomers from Ukraine to be able to use that program. We haven't had much success on that. So I do reach out to ministers every time I come here, hoping to be able to meet with them. We just weren't able to do that this time.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about these dollars and how you're essentially trying to set up a parameter where the federal government has to go through the provincial government in order to negotiate these deals, if as a result of this process that you're now going to set up, if dollars do not make their way to municipalities and provincial entities, will the province make up the dollars that the federal government is offering?
Well, I can tell you what I would expect to see. I would expect to see that they would deal with us in good faith. I think that the provinces in the past have been very successful in having a united front in saying that we should all be getting our equal per capita share. We all have housing needs. We all have infrastructure needs. We all have transportation project needs. And I think we're all having the same frustration that the federal government seems to be pitting one province against the other. It's not an appropriate way for them to be conducting themselves. And I think you'll probably hear the Premier say more about that as we go forward with our COF meetings. Now,
you yourself say there are certain ministers that you find you can work with fairly well. Do you care to name them so that there might be an example for the federal government?
I often text Francois-Philippe Champagne. In fact, I was just texting him yesterday as well, because the federal government is making great progress on getting the Trans Mountain Pipeline to the finish line, which is going to be such a great project, not only for us, but for Canada as a whole. And it's just one example of the kind of things that I think the federal government should be focused on, that kind of critical infrastructure to be able to help us get our goods to market. And so I will express gratitude when they're doing their job well. The problem is they should be doing their job well and stop trying to do all of the Premier's jobs. If they want to work with us, happy to partner with them, but they shouldn't be trying to do workarounds on us.
So much of a relationship is about the relationship at the top. I'm wondering how you would describe your relationship with the Prime Minister right now, what you want to see or how you want to see that relationship develop?
You know, I've had a number of occasions to talk with him. When I find it especially urgent, I make sure to reach out and have a meeting or a phone call. But at the moment, I would say that what all the premiers are looking for is a First Minister's Conference. We haven't had one where we get together as premiers with the Prime Minister at the table to talk about our key issues. One thing we put on the table was the carbon tax, which even their NDP coalition partner is saying is not performing the way it should and is questioning whether or not it should continue, and also urging him to meet with the premiers. We would talk about housing. We would talk about asymmetric federalism. We would talk about them meeting their targets when it comes to supporting Indigenous nations for healthcare and a variety of other things. And so I would say at the moment, what I'd like to see is a First Minister's Conference, so all of us together can have this conversation about how our relationship should work.
Okay. Well, you didn't answer the question, but I'm out of time. But I'm going to pick it up again another time. But until then, Premier Danielle Smith, I always appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Take care.